The Nightsisters of Dathomir are a mysterious and dangerous race. Sorcery, malevolence, and a sistership like no other run through the core of this society. Hey guys, my name is Mithril. Welcome back to Mithril Towers and another Star Wars Shatterpoint painting tutorial. Today I'm taking the plunge and tackling a model that I've been quite intimidated by for quite a while, and I've put off for quite a while as well. The fan favourite, Asajj Ventress. Apprenticed to Count Dooku, Nightsister, and brought to mainstream prominence thanks to the Clone Wars.
The pleasure's all mine.
Asajj is one of those models that has quite an unvaried colour palette, yet one that's quite intimidating, particularly in absolutely nailing that characteristic Nightsister skin and look, which can ultimately make or break the model. I'm going to be using a lot of desaturated grey hues intermixed with some subtle purples and cold hues to try and capture her Nightsister complexion as best I can. Combining this with some really vibrant, almost pearlescent blues and purples across her dress, and all finished off with some super bright spot colours, namely the sash detailing and of course her blood red Sith sabers. Trying my best not to mention the intricate detailing of the freehand purple tattoos and markings that adorn her head. I'm going to be working off a grey primer for my undercoat, as this will just help balance the more muted tones that are neither super bright nor super dark, as befitting a white or black primer. Well, at the risk of upsetting the Great Mother by not cracking on and getting Asajj painted, I put this off for long enough, so brush is ready guys, and let's get painting. Now the Nightsisters have a very unique skin tone. It's quite grey, washed out, and very ghostly with some subtle hues of blue and purple that run throughout from sister to sister. So I'm going to try my best to capture this super early on in my base coat stages. To begin with, I'm applying a base coat to her head, chest, back and hands with nacre, mixing this with a very, very small amount of Eldandil purple, roughly to a 5:1 ratio or less. I only want a subtle hint of purple to run through here. I'm not aiming for a predominant purple hue. Now I'm applying a base coat to Ventress's long flowing dress using Cantabaric blue, giving this a few thin down coats to help get a smooth, clean finish. Now here you can add a small amount of Eldandil again into the mix, as you did with the face. This will just give it a more mystical, otherworldly hue, but again remembering that the predominant colour here is going to be rich, vibrant blue. I'm picking out all the strapping and wrappings over her forearms, midriff and neck, as well as the long sash that hangs down the front, using pure Eldandil violet. Man, I really hope you got a fresh pot of this purple for this tutorial. The final base coat I'll be applying at this stage is carefully picking out the crisscross belt around her waist using Ledanis Grey. This has a very slight purple bluey hue, which will complement and help tie together the very bright tones of the wrappings and dress. Now to get the Nightsister skin tone that I want to achieve, I'm going to be using more of a relaxed and gradual method rather than some of the more predominantly stark tones I try and use for most of my other models. It's very important that I don't overblow the tone of the skin at this stage. I want to try and maintain a very ghostly spectral look to my Asajj Ventress. I'm going to get my shading in place and try to create some subtle shadows over the skin and just reinforce that slight purple tint that I already have from the base coat. To do this, I'm applying a shade with some heavily thinned down Druchii Violet, working this into all the recessed details and trying to avoid it pooling over the smoother, flatter surfaces. So the facial details on Ventress are very interesting and can prove quite challenging at the same time. As you can see, her facial features and her bone structure are very sharp and very pronounced, which is in keeping with how she looked in the Clone Wars TV series. And then you have the large, round, smooth, bald top of her head, which almost directly contrasts in style with the rest of her features. The challenge comes in trying to marry these up and create consistency across the whole head. To begin this process, I'm going to be relayering over all her exposed flesh using the same base coat mix from earlier. I'm focusing very early on here at trying to define those sharp features over her face and musculature to really tie in that malevolent Sith Witch look, leaving the subtle purple shade showing in the recesses, around the ears, the neckline, and defining the chest and back a little bit more. I'm now working up the sharp details further now by applying a pre-highlight layer using pure nacre. Now keeping good control over your brush here will be key to really defining her jawbone, chin and angular features. I'm not striving for a blended look, instead really trying to outline the rigid outline of her bodily features. The top of her head is slightly different. I'm feathering this in very carefully around the ears and the neckline to try and give a natural definition to a shape that ultimately doesn't have any sculpted definition. Okay, so now Ventress has the majority of her facial features layered in, and you can see the malevolence and the sharpness of the character really starting to come through, even through the really desaturated and washed out colours I'm using at the moment. To further define the skin, I'm going to be working in some white into the nacre layer, starting at a rough ratio of 3:1 and then gradually building up. As you can see, I'm just drawing this in thin lines over the most pronounced and sharpest areas of her facial features and bone structure to try and pull out a slight skeletal look to our Nightsister. Slowly building this up to an extreme edge highlight using pure white. Now I'm only looking to catch the absolute extreme of Asajj's features here, namely the tip and bridge of the nose, the brow line, tops of the cheekbones, framing her chest, knuckles and shoulder bones, as well as drawing this in two razor thin lines back from her temples across the bald head, just to act as a refraction of light across the surface. Okay, now it's on to some final facial details just to really draw out her character. Firstly, I'm going to be applying a thin line of Bloodfest Crimson across her lips to act as her lipstick. This is a burgundy shade which will pop but not stand out too much against all the greys and whites currently in situ. Now what is probably the most daunting part of painting Asajj Ventress has finally descended upon us, the freehand tattoos. Not just freehand tattoos however, but purple freehand over smooth white skin tone. Totally not scary or intimidating in the slightest. The key here is patience. Patience and an extremely fine point to your brush. Using Eldandil Violet again, there are key markings you need to get in place here to finish off Asajj. Namely, 2 diagonal lines coming in above the nose bridge, 2 lines coming out of the side of the chin, either side of her mouth, the rigid spiral that comes around from the nape of her neck over the top of her head, and the line with a diamond centered down the middle of her nape. And this is by no means necessary, but as Asajj is so recognizable within Star Wars canon, it would be a shame not to try and get these in place. The hardest part will be trying to get the spiral symmetrical either side of the head, but like I say, patience, a fine point to your brush, and not overloading it with paint will give you the best chance of absolutely nailing this freehand design. Finally, a thin line of black was painted into the eye recesses. I've drawn this out to a point on the sides just to represent the eye makeup and sharpness to the eyes. Next, 2 dots of white were dot highlighted either side of the black just to finish off the pupils. Honestly, that's probably the scariest part of Asajj Ventress now finished. Everything else is going to be a breeze going forward. Now I've got to say, this is probably one of the best sculpted dresses I've ever seen on a model. The rigid lines and clearly defined folds of material are going to be an absolute joy to paint, especially after finishing the skin and the freehand. To begin with, I'm going to be applying a manual shade to all the recesses of the skirt, the stress lines around her chest and over the shoulders using deep blue. This is a lovely dark tone which will provide some beautiful shading with a few passes depending on how deep you want your shading to be. With my shading now in place, I'm going to be applying a blocking layer to the folds of the skirt and the breasts, shoulder pads and back of the dress now using pure Cantabaric blue. These rich, vibrant tones will really stand out against her washed out complexion. Now if you did opt to adding a little Eldandil into the base coat mix, you'll notice that it almost takes on a pearlescent look as you layer these areas up. Not a necessary addition, but I think it adds quite a lot to the character. I'm going to be building up the layers now by adding nacre into my Cantabaric blue. Now you can add this in gradual increments if you wish for a smoother, more blended transition, or a rough 3:1 ratio mix will work out just as well here leading up to the final highlight stage. As you can see, I'm just further defining the upper folds of material. This is the very forgiving part of the model, so shouldn't prove too strenuous. For the final highlight stage, I've added yet more nacre into the previous mix, and then now just focusing on the uppermost peaks of material, framing the breasts and neckline of the dress, as well as picking out the stress points of material where her form is pressing up against the inside. You can add as much or as little nacre as you want, depending on how bright you want your final highlight. However, I would recommend no more than a 1 part Cantabaric to 3 parts nacre for the final mix. It's now time to tackle all the wrappings and the purple areas. It's important to be able to differentiate these areas from the rest of the dress to stop the model becoming too monotone and just basically a big blob of blue and white. I'm bringing up the tones of the purples initially by applying an all-over layer using violet. This will cover much better over the Eldandil base coat than it would the grey. Once again now using Eldandil Violet, albeit heavily diluted with water, I'm going to be shading the wrappings, sash and neck piece now by applying this as a shade. The texture of these areas is very close knit, so a wash works here much more than a manual shade would. With my shading now in place and dry, I'm going to pick out all the individual straps and the rings over the neck piece by using a 2:1 mix of violet and Miskatonic grey. The Miskatonic will raise the tone of the purple, but also give it that slightly desaturated look, which is very prominent over the rest of the model. I'll tell you what, trying to marry desaturated tones and vibrant tones here has never been more of a thing than on Asajj Ventress. I'm finally applying an edge highlight by adding white into the overall mix. Again, adding as much or as little depending on how bright you want these purple areas to be. Carefully framing the straps by concentrating on the edges and just highlighting the outer curve of the neck rings. Okay, so as is fairly obvious by now, the majority of this model is made up of skin, dress, and purple bits. So really, there's only a few finishing details left to get Asajj ready for the tabletop. To begin with, I'm carefully picking out all the raised detail over the front of the sash using Gobi Brown. As the recessed areas should all be purple now, then these won't be too hard to pick out. Here I'm also picking out the border of the sash with the same colour. I'm now further defining all the sash detail again by going over it, this time using Iroko, keeping my paint slightly thinned down just to prevent getting patchy coverage. I'm now finally framing the outside edges of all this detail, as well as the outline to the sash itself with a 1-to-1 mix of Iroko and white. This will just help lift it a little bit more and pop against the rest of the model. The metal emblem in the centre of her belt now needs to be carefully picked out using Amethyst Alchemy, which has a slight purpley hue to it. A targeted wash of Citadel Numb Oil is then applied just to give it a little bit of definition. Finally, I'm highlighting just the edges of the circle and the decal on the front using Speed Metal. The individual segments on the belt now I'm carefully picking out again using nacre, trying my best to leave the Ladanish grey showing in the recesses that separate each rectangular segment. There isn't really any need for a shade here, the base coat will serve as the only shade we should be needing. Once I'm happy with this, I'm going to apply just a quick extreme edge highlight around the edges of each segment using pure white, just to finish off the belt. It's time to carefully pick out the hilts of Asajj's sabers now using black metal, being extremely careful not to clip any of the finished skin. The raised detail over the saber hilts was then highlighted with some very thin lines of speed metal. The ringlets on the saber hilts I'm now very, very carefully picking out with Eclipse Grey. This is totally optional, to be honest, and you can't even see these areas once the mod is on the table, but I know it's there. At this stage as well, I carefully picked out her boots using Eclipse Grey as well. These were then given a quick edge highlight around the edges of the boots and the creases in material using Rainy Grey. Now you're going to see the final touch that really ties Ventress together. The saber blades are being given a coat using blood red, applying this in a smooth, controlled fashion to minimise any risk of blemishing. The upper parts of the blades then need to be highlighted with a mix of blood red and white, again going as bright or as dull as you want with your highlight here, depending how bright and dangerous you want these blades to look. You know what? I was going to try and find and recite some Nightsister chant to really hammer home the theme of today's video. But I struggle enough with English, and I've seen enough horror films to probably not chance chanting anything here. But here we have my finished Asajj Ventress model, character perfectly captured down to the smallest detail, with a minimal colour palette and a beautifully sculpted model. If I were a clone or a Jedi, I'd certainly be sleeping with one eye open. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I really hope you enjoyed. Please remember to like, subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. And until next time guys, take care and happy hobbying. Bye guys.